Northern Montana, January 1978. Nobody paid much attention to the glow coming from Vernon Hadley's barn that winter. Not at first. A kerosene lamp, they figured. Maybe the man working late on equipment. But the light stayed steady, night after night, even when the wind screamed down from Canada at 40 miles an hour and temperatures dropped to 20 below. What they didn't know, what they couldn't see through the weathered plank walls, was that Vernon wasn't storing hay or fixing machinery. He was living inside a corrugated steel tunnel he'd built in the middle of that barn. A 12 by 20-foot Quonset hut, gleaming like a silver cocoon, sitting 40 feet from the nearest exterior wall. The whole county thought he'd lost his mind. Vernon's original cabin sat 200 yards east, a decent structure by frontier standards, chinked logs, and a stone foundation. But the wind found every gap. The firewood pile stayed wet under tarps that never quite held. And propane? Rationed that year. Expensive. Unreliable. So Vernon did something nobody expected. He built smaller. He built inside. And when the coldest blizzard in 45 years buried Montana under 6 feet of snow and wind chills that touched 70 below zero, the men who'd called him a coward stopped laughing. If you want to see the temperature reading that made the county's best builders go silent, stay until the end. Hit that like button, subscribe for one technique every week that worked when survival wasn't optional, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Let's get into it. Vernon Hadley wasn't an eccentric. He was a ranch hand, 42 years old, ex-Navy Seabee, the kind of man who could weld a cracked axle at midnight and have it back under a tractor by dawn. He'd built his own cabin in 1974, cut the logs himself, stacked a fieldstone chimney that drew clean. But 4 winters in, he was burning through 12 cords of wood a season and still waking to frost on the inside of his windows. The problems were obvious once you looked. The cabin sat exposed on a rise, catching northwest wind like a sail. His firewood shed stood 30 yards away, open on 3 sides. Every piece of split pine he carried inside brought moisture with it, hissing and smoking instead of burning hot. The draft from the floorboards was so strong it could snuff a candle 6 feet from the hearth. Vernon knew the math. More wood meant more cutting, more hauling, more time away from the livestock. And in January of '78, with propane prices doubled and delivery trucks stuck on impassable roads, burning inefficiently wasn't just uncomfortable. It was dangerous. He'd been thinking about insulation, about banking the foundation with earth, about building a vestibule. Then in November, he saw the Quonset. A neighbor 2 valleys over was tearing down an old equipment shed, military surplus, probably from the 50s. Corrugated steel arches, each one 8 feet wide, bolted together into a tunnel. The kind of structure the Army used for everything from storage to field hospitals. Lightweight, portable, airtight when assembled right. Vernon bought the whole thing for $60 and a case of beer. His plan was simple. Assemble it inside the barn. Not next to the barn. Not attached to the barn. Inside. The barn itself was 40 by 60 feet, built in the 1920s with hand-hewn beams and plank siding. It leaked light through 100 cracks, but the bones were solid. Vernon cleared the center bay, swept the dirt floor flat, and started bolting arches together on a timber frame. 12 feet wide, 20 feet long, 7 feet tall at the crown. A half-cylinder of ribbed steel that fit entirely within the barn's envelope, with 20 feet of clearance on all sides. He insulated the Quonset floor with sawdust packed 8 inches deep, then laid planks over it. He cut a door in one end and installed a small barrel stove. Nothing fancy, just a vertical drum with a 6-inch stovepipe venting up and out through the barn roof. He built shelving along the inside walls, hung a kerosene lamp from the ridgeline. Then he moved in. The theory, if you could call it that, was layered protection. The Quonset shell stopped convection. The barn blocked wind. The air gap between them acted as a buffer zone, an accidental thermal envelope that would slow heat loss the way a thermos bottle works. But Vernon didn't explain it that way. When his neighbor asked what he was doing, Vernon just said he was tired of freezing. And that's when the ridicule started. Picture it. A silver tunnel sitting in the middle of a cavernous barn, surrounded by hay bales and old equipment, lit from within by the flicker of a single flame. It looked like a survival bunker. It looked like someone hiding from the world. It looked, to most people who saw it, completely insane. But the engineering, accidental or otherwise, was smarter than it appeared. The Quonset hut itself was an efficient shape. Corrugated steel reflects radiant heat back toward the source, and the arched form sheds wind naturally, though wind wasn't the issue here. What mattered was the shell's airtightness. With the door sealed and the stovepipe fitted snug, there were no drafts. No cold air creeping in at ankle height. No heat pouring out through gaps in the chinking. That alone would have improved things. But Vernon's real advantage was the barn. 40 feet of open space in every direction. The barn walls took the brunt of the wind, rattling and creaking under every gust, but the Quonset sat in dead calm. No convection, no wind chill, stripping heat from the steel. The air inside the barn stayed cold, maybe 10 or 15 degrees warmer than outside, but it was still air, and still air doesn't conduct heat nearly as fast as moving air. Then there was the wood. Vernon stacked his firewood along the interior barn walls, protected from snow and rain. In that dry, ventilated space, even green cut would season fast. By mid-December, he had bone-dry fuel within arm's reach of the Quonset door. No more hauling wet logs through drifts. No more struggling to keep a fire alive with wood that steamed instead of burned. The barrel stove was small, maybe a quarter the size of the hearth in his old cabin, but it didn't need to be big. The Quonset's interior volume was 300 cubic feet, compared to the cabin's 1,500. Heating a smaller space required less fuel and less time. And with the steel shell radiating warmth evenly, there were no cold corners, no dead zones where heat pooled uselessly at the ceiling. Vernon could load the stove at sundown, bank it with ash, and wake 8 hours later to a space that still held 55 degrees. His old cabin? He'd wake to 40, sometimes 35. But nobody cared about the physics. They cared about appearances. And the appearance was Vernon Hadley, a man in his prime, had retreated into a metal kin in a barn like a hermit or a coward. Word spread fast in a county where everyone knew everyone. Hadley's living in his barn now, they'd say at the grain elevator, at the diner, at Sunday services. Built himself a little hidey hole. Says he's warmer that way. The laughter was quiet at first. A smirk, a raised eyebrow, but it grew. Charlie Brennan, a carpenter with 30 years of experience and a reputation for building houses that lasted, saw Vernon's setup in late November. He stood in the barn doorway, arms crossed, staring at the Quonset like it was an insult. "That's not a home," Charlie said. "That's a damn grain bin." Vernon didn't argue. He just nodded and said it worked. "For now," Charlie replied. "Wait till that stove overheats the steel and you can't touch the walls. Wait till condensation drips on you all night. Wait till the cold really comes." Others echoed the sentiment. A rancher named Paul Dietrich, man who ran 500 head of cattle and prided himself on toughness, stopped by one afternoon and laughed out loud when he saw the interior. Sleeping bag on a cot, wood stove glowing, shelves nailed to the ribs of the Quonset like it was a submarine. "Jesus, Vernon," Paul said, shaking his head. "You turning into a mole?" At the post office, Vernon overheard two men talking. One of them, a hired hand from a neighboring ranch, said, "Real men don't hide from winter. They face it." The other agreed. "My granddad built a sod house with a dirt floor and raised 6 kids. Hadley's got a perfectly good cabin, and he's sleeping in a barn." Even Vernon's sister, calling from Billings, expressed concern. "People are talking," she said. "They think you're struggling." Vernon told her he was fine. Better than fine, actually. Warmer. Using half the wood. Sleeping through the night without waking to reload the fire. "Well," she said, "it sounds lonely." Maybe it was. But loneliness didn't freeze you to death. The judgment wasn't just about the structure. It was about what the structure represented. In a culture that valued self-sufficiency, endurance, and a certain brand of rugged masculinity, retreating into a smaller, stranger shelter felt like giving up. Like admitting you couldn't handle what your neighbors handled. Vernon didn't see it that way. He saw a problem and a solution. The problem was heat loss. The solution was reducing surface area, eliminating drafts, and keeping fuel dry. But nobody asked him to explain. They just assumed he'd cracked under the pressure of a hard life and an unforgiving climate. By mid-December, Vernon had stopped going into town unless he had to. Not because he was ashamed, he wasn't, but because he was tired of defending a decision that, to him, needed no defense. He'd know soon enough if he was right. January 7th, 1978. The National Weather Service issued warnings across Montana, North Dakota, and Wyoming. A low-pressure system was dropping out of Alberta, massive, slow-moving, loaded with moisture. Forecasters called it a bomb cyclone. Temperatures would plummet. Winds would exceed 50 miles an hour. Snow would fall for days. It wasn't hyperbole. By the morning of January 9th, the temperature in northern Montana had fallen to 18 below zero. By noon, 28 below. The wind turned the air into something solid, something that burned exposed skin in seconds. Ranchers scrambled to get livestock into shelter. People duct-taped windows, stacked sandbags against doors, pulled every blanket they owned out of closets. And then the snow started. Not the light, picturesque kind. This was heavy, wet, wind-driven snow that buried fence lines, collapsed sheds, and turned roads into impassable trenches. Plows couldn't keep up. Power lines snapped under the weight of ice. By January 11th, whole towns were cut off. Vernon's closest neighbor, a man named Ed Larson, lived a mile and a half south. Ed had a solid house, 2-story, wood frame, newer insulation. He also had a propane furnace and a wood stove for backup. The propane ran out on the second day of the storm. The tank was supposed to have been refilled in December, but the delivery truck never made it. Ed switched to the wood stove full-time. Problem was his firewood pile sat outside, buried under 4 feet of snow. What he could dig out was soaked. It took 20 minutes and a full edition of newspaper to get a single log burning, and even then, it smoldered more than it flamed. Ed's thermometer, mounted inside near the kitchen, read 41 degrees. At night, it dropped to 35. He piled on clothes. He burned furniture. He slept in the same room as the stove and still woke shivering. Other families fared worse. A ranch house 6 miles west lost its chimney when ice broke the flue. Smoke filled the interior, forcing the family into their truck with the engine running, burning gasoline they couldn't replace. They lasted 2 days before someone on a snowmobile found them and hauled them to town. The wind was relentless. 50-mile-an-hour gusts that rattled walls and tore shingles off roofs. The sound alone was exhausting, a constant roar like standing next to a jet engine. And the cold. On January 12th, the official temperature in Cut Bank, Montana, hit 47 below zero. With wind chill, it was 70 below, the kind of cold that turns diesel to gel. That freezes moisture in your lungs. That kills cattle standing in open pasture. Nobody was going outside unless they absolutely had to. Inside his Quonset hut, Vernon Hadley sat by the barrel stove, feeding it 1 piece of dry pine every 2 hours. The temperature inside the hut held at 62 degrees. Stay with me, because when the storm finally cleared and people started comparing notes, the numbers Vernon logged made even the skeptics go quiet. Hit that like button if you're still here, and drop a comment with your location. Let's see where everyone's watching from. The blizzard lasted 6 days. When it finally broke on January 15th, the sky cleared to a brutal, crystalline blue. The kind of cold that makes the air itself visible. Frozen moisture hanging in shafts of sunlight, every breath a cloud. The temperature was still 31 below zero at noon. The landscape was unrecognizable. Drifts 10 feet high against buildings. Entire vehicles buried. Power lines down for miles. Roads wouldn't be passable for another week. Ed Larson was the first to make it to Vernon's place, arriving on a snowmobile mid-afternoon. He expected to find Vernon in rough shape, maybe holed up in the main cabin, maybe rationing the last of his firewood. Instead, he found Vernon outside the barn, splitting wood in shirt sleeves. "You okay?" Ed called over the engine noise, pulling off his balaclava. Vernon looked up, nodded. "Doing fine." "You, Ed, killed the engine. Froze my ass off for 6 days. Burned through 3 weeks of wood. Almost ran out. He paused, studying Vernon. You serious? You were okay. Come see. Ed followed Vernon into the barn. The temperature inside was noticeably warmer than outside, maybe 10 degrees. Still cold, but the wind was gone. And in the center of that massive space sat the Quonset hut, its steel surface reflecting the afternoon light coming through gaps in the barn siding. Vernon opened the door. The wave of warmth hit Ed like a physical thing. He stepped inside, blinking. A thermometer hung from one of the steel ribs, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. 68. You're kidding me, Ed said. Vernon pointed to a small notebook on a makeshift table, a plank across 2 sawhorses. Logged it every 4 hours. Coldest it got in here was 55. That was the night of the 12th, when it hit 47 below outside. Ed picked up a notebook. The entries were meticulous. Date, time, interior temperature, exterior temperature, wood consumed. On January 12th, when the storm was at its worst, 6 a.m., interior 58 degrees Fahrenheit, exterior minus 43 degrees Fahrenheit 10 a.m., interior 62 degrees Fahrenheit, exterior minus 47 degrees Fahrenheit 2 p.m., interior 64 degrees Fahrenheit, exterior minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit 6 p.m., interior 61 degrees Fahrenheit, exterior minus 41 degrees Fahrenheit 10 p.m., interior 57 degrees Fahrenheit, exterior minus 39 degrees Fahrenheit 2 a.m., interior 55 degrees Fahrenheit, exterior minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit. How much wood did you burn? Ed asked. Vernon flipped to a summary page. 112 pounds total. 6 days. That's about 19 pounds a day. Ed stared at him. I burned 200 pounds a day. Minimum. Vernon nodded. I figured. Most folks probably did. The math was staggering. Over 6 days, Ed had consumed 1,200 pounds of firewood and still shivered through nights in the low 30s. Vernon had burned just over 100 pounds and maintained a temperature differential of 90 to 100 degrees between inside and outside. The efficiency wasn't just better. It was an order of magnitude better. But how? Ed asked. It's just steel. There's no insulation. Vernon walked him through it. The Quonset shell eliminated drafts, every crack, every gap that normally bled heat. The barn blocked wind, so there was no convective cooling on the exterior surface. The air gap between the barn walls and the Quonset acted as a buffer, a dead zone that slowed conductive heat loss. And the small interior volume meant less space to heat. Steel's actually pretty good at radiating heat back, Vernon said. Reflects it. That barrel stove throws heat in all directions, and the walls just bounce it around instead of letting it escape. Ed pointed at the stovepipe. What about up there? 6-inch pipe. Double-walled where it goes through the roof. Some heat loss, sure, but not much. Most of the heat stays low, where I need it. Then there was the wood itself. Vernon opened the Quonset door and gestured to the stacks lining the barn's interior walls. Dry. Bone dry. Protected from snow. Ventilated by the barn's natural airflow. Green wood's maybe 50–60% water by weight, Vernon explained. You burn half your energy just boiling that off. Dry wood? All heat. Burns hotter, burns cleaner, burns longer. Ed did the mental calculation. If Vernon's wood was burning twice as efficiently due to dryness alone, and his structure was losing heat at a fraction of the rate. Yeah, the numbers made sense. They made sense in a way that was almost embarrassing. Does Charlie know? Ed asked. Charlie Brennan, the carpenter who'd called the Quonset a grain bin. Not yet. He's going to hate this. Vernon smiled. Probably. By the end of January, word had spread. People started showing up. Neighbors, ranchers, even a county building inspector who'd heard the story secondhand and didn't believe it. Vernon let them all inside, showed them the notebook, explained the setup. Some apologized. Most just stood there, looking around, recalculating everything they thought they knew about staying warm. One detail stuck with everyone. On the worst night of the storm, when the wind chill outside hit 70 below and families huddled around dying fires, Vernon Hadley had slept through the night in a t-shirt. No middle of the night reloading. No waking to frozen breath on the pillow. Just 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep in a space that never dropped below 55 degrees. Charlie Brennan came by in early February. He didn't say much, just walked around the Quonset, tapped the steel with his knuckles, peered at the stove setup. Finally, he turned to Vernon. "You got lucky," Charlie said. Vernon shrugged. "Maybe. Still looks like a grain bin. Warm grain bin." Charlie almost smiled. "Almost. Yeah, all right. It's warm." That was as close to an apology as Vernon was going to get, and they both knew it. Spring came late in 1978. Snow lingered into April. But by the time the roads were fully clear and ranchers could move freely between properties, something had shifted in the valley. People weren't calling Vernon a coward anymore. They were calling him smart. The first adaptation appeared in March. A rancher named Hank Svoboda, who ran a small operation 15 miles south, had an old dairy barn he wasn't using. He'd lost a third of his firewood supply to moisture damage that winter and nearly frozen out his family in the process. Hank didn't have a surplus Quonset hut, but he had steel roofing panels left over from a shed project. He built a 12 by 14-foot shelter inside the barn, framed it with 2x4s, sheathed it with the roofing panels, insulated the gaps with straw bales, added a small wood stove vented through the barn roof, moved his family in for the tail end of winter. It worked, not as efficiently as Vernon's setup. The construction was cruder, the seals weren't as tight, but it worked well enough. Hank's wife later told Vernon they'd cut their wood consumption in half and slept warmer than they had all season. By summer, 3 more families had built variations of the concept. One used a pole barn with a framed interior core lined with sheet metal. Another repurposed an old grain bin, cutting a door and installing a chimney. A third simply insulated a corner of their existing barn and lived in that section through the following winter. None of them looked exactly like Vernon's Quonset, but they all followed the same principle: create a small, airtight shelter inside a larger windbreak. Use the outer structure to kill convection. Store firewood in the buffer zone. Heat a smaller volume with dry fuel. The county extension agent, a man named Robert Kilmer who advised farmers on everything from crop rotation to equipment maintenance, visited Vernon in late May. He brought a notebook and a camera. "Mind if I document this?" Robert asked. "I want to write it up. Share it with other districts." Vernon agreed. Robert spent an afternoon measuring, photographing, interviewing. He published a bulletin that fall: Efficient Cold Weather Shelter, Lesson from the 1978 Blizzard. It included diagrams of Vernon's setup, temperature logs, wood consumption data, and notes on variations other families had built. The bulletin circulated through Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. Some people dismissed it. Others filed it away as a curiosity. But a few, the ones living in marginal areas, the ones on tight budgets, the ones who'd nearly frozen that winter, paid attention. By 1980, at least a dozen families within a 100-mile radius had adopted some version of the barn shelter concept. Some were seasonal, used only during the coldest months. Others became permanent. A homesteader near Havre built an entire off-grid compound around the idea, with a Quonset core inside a large pole barn, plus attached greenhouse spaces that captured solar heat during the day. Vernon himself made a few refinements. He added a small window on the south-facing in for daylight, built a vestibule entry to reduce heat loss when opening the door, installed a rack above the stove for drying clothes and gear. By his third winter in the Quonset, he had the system dialed in so precisely that he could predict his weekly wood consumption to within 5 pounds. He never moved back to the main cabin. Eventually, he sold it to a young couple and stayed in the Quonset year-round. People stopped thinking it was strange. It became simply Vernon's place. The ridicule, the judgment, the mockery faded into a kind of grudging respect. Not because Vernon had proven everyone wrong in some dramatic, confrontational way, but because when the crisis came, when the cold was real and the stakes were survival, his solution had worked. Quietly, efficiently, undeniably. And in a culture that valued results over rhetoric, that mattered more than pride. There's an old saying in the mountains: the weather doesn't care what you think is proper. Vernon Hadley didn't set out to revolutionize cold weather living. He didn't have a manifesto or a theory. He just looked at a problem: heat loss, wasted fuel, brutal wind, and stripped it down to physics. Reduce volume. Eliminate drafts. Block convection. Keep fuel dry. The Quonset hut inside the barn wasn't beautiful. It wasn't traditional. It didn't fit anyone's idea of what a real home should look like. But it kept a man alive and comfortable through a blizzard that killed livestock, collapsed buildings, and left families shivering in their own living rooms. What the skeptics missed, what Charlie Brennan and Paul Dietrich and all the others missed, was that survival doesn't require suffering. Efficiency isn't weakness, and sometimes the smartest move is to build smaller, not bigger. Vernon lived in that Quonset for another 18 years. He was still there in 1996 when a journalist from a regional magazine came to interview him about frontier ingenuity. By then, Vernon was 60 and the story had taken on a life of its own, exaggerated in some retellings, simplified in others. The journalist asked if he'd do it again. Vernon thought for a moment. "I'd skip the part where everyone called me crazy," he said. "But yeah, I'd do it again. Because when you're facing 47 below zero and the wind is trying to rip the walls off your house, you don't need approval. You need a plan that works." Vernon had one, and that made all the difference. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever survived? And if you got value from this story, if you learned something about efficiency, about resilience, about thinking differently when it matters, hit that subscribe button. Every week, we bring you one technique, one story, one piece of wisdom that kept people alive when the world didn't offer second chances. Thanks for watching. Stay warm out there. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.